Well, let me start by saying good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for participating tonight. We are meeting for the third time to continue our examination of salient moments in the history of ChevyChase DC for the purpose of addressing the question, how can we work today in our neighborhood toward redeeming the promises of equality in our nation's founding document, the Declaration of Independence? In our opening session, we explored the links of Chevy Chase to George Washington through the descendants of George Pointer, who rose to become the supervisory engineer of the first major national infrastructure project, forerunner of the C&O Canal. That project led, by way of the Mount Vernon Conference of March 1785, to the adoption of our Constitution, drafted 2 years later in Philadelphia. A second link to Washington were descendants of Caroline Branham, house servant at Mount Vernon, who was present at the first president's deathbed. In our second session, we focused on the cluster of free Black families who settled on Broad Branch Road in Chevy Chase, DC. Two Pointer descendants fought in the Union Army with the first Black regiments of the U.S. colored troops. The valor of these 180,000 fighters was decisive in prevailing over the Confederacy. The Civil War was a second founding of the Republic. It brought emancipation for the roughly 4 million enslaved people in the United States. During Reconstruction, 3 amendments to the Constitution underwrote their rights as citizens of this country. The 13th abolished slavery. The 14th guaranteed citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. And the 15th prohibited the federal and state governments from denying a citizen the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, tonight, we consider the consequences of the tragic reversal of these gains, dramatized by the withdrawal of federal troops from the states of the Confederacy in 1877. The tragedy did not spare Chevy Chase. A regime of racial segregation was put into place as a new mechanism to subject African Americans to subaltern status and a newly adapted form of servitude. The doctrine was formalized legally in the Supreme Court's Plessy versus Ferguson judgment of 1896. To take one example, DC's accommodation of African Americans in the system of public education launched in 1862 was segregated from the start. These so-called Jim Crow arrangements attracted foreign attention. Soon after their assumption of power in Germany, the Nazi government sent officials from the Ministry of the Interior to the United States to learn how a population might be contained and dispossessed. Their findings fed into the 1935 Nuremberg laws aimed at Germany's Jewish population that defined who was a German and who one could marry, a key step toward the Holocaust. So the central theme of tonight's panel is displacement. We start with Jocelyn Julian's account of her ancestors living in the dry meadow plot of land along Broad Branch Road between current-day Casada and Northampton Streets. Like tonight's other panelists, Jocelyn is a historic Chevy Chase DC board member. She is the fourth great-granddaughter of Caroline Branham, great-granddaughter of Rosa Branham Shorter, and granddaughter of Anna Shorter Chambers. She descends from a long line of resilient individuals who succeeded in raising families and building lives despite significant obstacles. Professionally, she serves as the director and alternative dispute resolution practitioner of the state's attorney's office in Annapolis, Maryland, where she facilitates constructive dialogue to reach equitable resolutions. Now, Jocelyn began researching her family history to investigate a childhood memory of her grandmother claiming a connection to George Washington. Through extensive research, she has connected with fellow descendants of enslaved communities at George Washington's Mount Vernon, Arlington House, and the African American community at Broad Branch Road in ChevyChase DC. Her ongoing work to uncover these roots serves as a foundation for future generations to discover their own history. Now, modern Chevy Chase was the racialized ordering of space. Francis Newlands, as we'll see, could realize partially at least his vision of a white America, a domestic empire in the age of imperialism, aggressively deploying wealth and power to that effect. I will address this aspect of our subject. I do so as a political scientist whose career was defined by developments in Europe. As it turns out, this wide aperture helps generate insights into our local situation. Now, Aristotle thought that man is by nature political, the Greek zoon politikon. The drafters of the Declaration of Independence created a republic in the Aristotelian tradition. For them, to be political implied stakeholding in the community. In practice, that was defined as property holding. So the alienation of property was, by definition, inhuman. Mark Auslander takes this as his point of departure. A native DC Chevy chaser who got his graduate degrees at Chicago and began his career in historical anthropology in Zambia, Mark returned home to develop a keen interest in how the African slave trade created our racial geography. Mark has vast experience in running museums, teaching, research, and publications. Okay, so just before passing the baton to Jocelyn, let me say a word about your participation and provide a short preview of the final session of this 250 webinar series. I'll begin with the observation that none of us would be here tonight without the behind-the-scenes research and promotional work of Kate Atkinson. Thanks, Kate. But now that you are here, let me emphasize that we very much welcome your commentary and questions. Please be the life of our party. Our production supremo, Chaz Cadwell, also functions as curator of your interventions. Please use the chat box to raise a point or pose a question at any time during tonight's event. Finally, the good news is that displacement, despite the human and societal casualties along the way, was not the end of the story. We can and we must learn from our past and build a better future. Our fourth and final webinar in this 250 series airs Wednesday, June 24th at 7 o'clock. In it, we will consider how the civil rights movement transformed our collective sensibilities, ended de jure segregation, and opened a new agenda for participation, justice, economic opportunity, and housing opportunities. Partial home rule in DC was an incomplete democratizing measure, but it expanded our horizons and encouraged us to recover our own history and begin the process of repair associated with corresponding insights. We hope to see you next month on the 24th. And with that, Jocelyn, you have the word.
Thank you, Carl. Hello and good evening to everybody. As you know, I'm Jocelyn Edwards Julian, fourth great-granddaughter of Caroline Branham. Now, to understand the full weight of what my family and other African-American families endured through the use of eminent domain in ChevyChase DC, I must begin with the stories of a matriarch and a patriarch from two different families, the Dorsey Branham Shorters and the Pointer Harrises. Despite being enslaved and forced to live under brutal, life-threatening conditions, they not only survived, they endured, resisted, and ultimately flourished. Their strength is the foundation for everything that came after. Let me see if I can get this. I'd like to share So, excuse me, Caroline Branham, as I said, my fourth great grandmother was the matriarch of our family, and she was born in 1764. She was, of course, enslaved by George and Martha Washington. She lived and served in his home, their home, her entire life. Caroline was present at George Washington's bedroom at his death, and upon Martha Washington's death, Caroline was uprooted and sent to live at Arlington House with Martha's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, with whom she bore children. And I start with this because this is, at least as far as I know, the beginning of the continuation of being uprooted from all that you know, with very little notification. Caroline didn't have a say in where she lived, what clothes she wore, whose children she bore. In the 1820s, though, Jared Sparks interviewed Caroline for his biography of Washington, which she did cleverly in exchange for the freedom of her toddler grandson, Robert H. Robinson. George Poynter, the patriarch of the Harris Fisher family, was born a slave in Frederick County, Maryland, on October 11, 1773. And in 1786, at age 13, Poynter started working for the Potomac Company, started by George Washington. The company's purpose was to make the Potomac River Canal safer to transport goods and materials. This would also make it much easier to transport needed building materials to the newly forming capital city. Captain Poynter piloted his boat along the canal and was given a cottage along the banks of the Potomac River. He lived in that cottage for more than 40 years. And in 1829, the C&O Canal Company planned to build a canal that would run straight through the land where his small cottage stood. To protect his home, Poynter wrote a 12-page letter to the company's board on September 5th, 1829. In trying to explain why his home mattered, he ended up telling the story of his life along the river and the important people he met through his work, such as General George Washington, Colonel George Gilpin, Georgetown engineer Josiah Thompson, and Colonel John Fitzgerald, a Revolutionary War officer and friend of Washington. So, in highlighting these two individuals, I'm trying to drive the point home that even though they established their lives, their livelihoods and family, they still had the threat of being removed without a moment's notice. Now, after the end of slavery, many families migrated away from the plantations to forge new lives. Caroline's great-grandchildren, Rosa, Sarah, and Guy Branham, were born on their family's land, called the Guy Henry Tract, which abutted the Arlington House property. After their mother's death, Rosa and her siblings were sent to live with their aunt and uncle, Laura Henry and her husband, Robert Dorsey, on Broad Branch Road in Dry Meadows, ChevyChase DC, and here they are in these pictures. In 1883, my family lived in a tight-knit Black community on Broad Branch Road in a two-story house built by Robert Dorsey. Excuse me. Here we go. Aunt Laura owned and operated a small store selling her produce, chickens and eggs, that she raised on their farmette, as she called it. Rosa and her siblings went to school, worshiped, worked, and played with their friends on their land. They grew up, got married, and had their own children. My grandmother, Anna Shorter, was born and grew up in Dry Meadows with a great sense of pride in her home and community, so much so that she used her camera, to chronicle her everyday life. Excuse me. There we go. This picture is Anna's lifelong friend, Bessie Brooks, and her brother and friends camping in their own backyard. In the 1850s, Mary Harris, George Pointer's granddaughter, purchased 2.3 acres of land on Broad Branch Road and built a two-story house as well. Mary raised 8 children, 2 of whom were sent to fight in the Civil War. From 1928 to 1931, however, all that changed. Through eminent domain, the Shorters, Harrises, and other African American families were forced out of their homes, off their land, and away from their friends, their schools, their church, and their main source of income. They lost it all to make way for an all-white school and public park for the burgeoning white Chevy Chase community. And according to the Evening Star, March 4th, 1931, the district commissioners yesterday approved the purchase of a lot of land improved by a frame dwelling adjoining the Lafayette School, now under construction at Broad Branch Road and Oliver Street. The house is occupied by colored tenants. In explaining the reason for the purchase, Assistant Engineer Commissioner H.L. Robb wrote, "The presence of this house with its colored occupants so close to a white school is a source of possible friction that is thought desirable to remove." All of the African American families were gone. The Shorter, Harris, and Brooks families, to name a few. The Shorter family settled into a row house on Irving Street, hoping for stability, only to be forced out yet again when the city cleared their home to make way for another school. Each move was another reminder of how fragile their foothold in the community truly was. Rose's sister Sarah also endured a series of uprootings. After her husband's death, she moved her family from 8th Street to Sherman Avenue, trying to rebuild her life while carrying the weight of loss and the responsibility of keeping her family together. The Harrises scattered to various areas in D.C., wherever they could find a place to live and available jobs. According to the late and great James Fisher, a Pointer Harris descendant, his mother spent years moving from one neighborhood to another, always searching for a place where her children could feel safe. Each move was a deliberate choice, guided by her determination to find communities where they would be protected and where the schools were close enough for them to learn and grow without fear. The broader impact of this history and of the forced removal of a thriving African American community includes the loss of generational wealth, family stability, and a shared sense of belonging. When my family was displaced, they were scattered across the DC area. Some could not afford adequate housing and ended up living in 1 or 2-room dwellings with only curtains to create a sense of privacy between families. As a result, I grew up without knowing many of my cousins. The branches of my family scattered before I ever had the chance to reach them. It wasn't until a few years ago, through the unexpected power of DNA, that our paths finally crossed again, allowing us to reclaim connections that should never have been broken. The repeated use of eminent domain deeply shaped the disparity and accumulated assets among African Americans. Time and again, whenever an African American community managed to establish itself and begin to thrive, the proverbial rug was pulled out from under them. Families were displaced, cut off from their primary source of income and stability, and forced to start over with almost nothing. Land plays a crucial role in building long-term wealth. It is an asset, one that typically increases in value over time. Here in Chevy Chase, many properties are now worth millions of dollars. Give an example, less than 5 years ago, a home sold for 1.3 million and is now valued at roughly 1.9 million. And that family gained equity in just a few short years, wealth that grows, transfers, and strengthens across generations. The Dry Meadows community meant everything to our families. They had everything: a beautiful house, land to grow food, a prosperous grocery business, and a loving, close knit community. Shortly before my grandmother, Anna Shorter Chambers, seen here in the slide, passed away at the age of 102, she pleaded with us to take her back home. And when we asked her where home was, she answered simply and without hesitation, Chevy Chase. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you, Carl. It's now time for you, I believe.
Thanks, Jocelyn. My job is to contextualize what Jocelyn just said. What was the context for Jocelyn's story of displacement? How did modern Chevy Chase come about? And I'm going to talk about that for starters, referring to three megatrends that were occurring uh, in the period of Jim Crow in the last decade of the 19th century, first decade of the 20th century. So those three trends concerned ideology, migration, or demography, and technology. Starting with ideology, we had important developments, especially in biology, with Darwin's work that was published, The Origin of the Species, in 1859. Unfortunately, what sometimes happens with scientific discoveries, they go off the rails. And that's what happened with Darwin's insights. Faux science developed in the aftermath to justify what groups within society wanted to do to each other anyway. So race theory developed and translated itself into popular narratives about the relative talents of various peoples in the world. I mean, the whole concept of race itself is problematic for starters. And then starting there, the question is, how are these superficially different characteristics of the human population related to each other? So we had the rise of a kind of social Darwinism afterwards that led ultimately, unfortunately, to things like eugenics and the public policy that is associated with that. A second megatrend was migration. This was the period in the late 19th century when, and the first decade, especially of the 20th century, when the Great Migration began. It began for reasons having to do with push and pull. The push, of course, had to do with the end of Reconstruction and the new forms of servitude that were developing in the South, which is where almost all, not quite all, of the population of African Americans were living. So when they got an opportunity to move, many of them did. And they got that opportunity because the industrial development of the North in the cities, especially during the First World War, but also even prior to that, created the jobs that created the alternatives that pulled people out of the South, provided them with a prospect for a better life. And so many moved. And that was a development that also affected the DMV. very much so. So we have ideology, we have migration, and the third element that is important for us to contextualize what Jocelyn just talked about is technology. So we had um, a horse-drawn economy until the first decade of the 20th century. And actually, late in the 1880s, we had the first appearance of electric streetcars. And one of the peculiarities of history of ChevyChase DC and ChevyChase, Maryland, is that they were one of the first streetcar suburbs. So everything, and gas cars, of course, followed in particular. This is important because by 1908, with the introduction of the Model T Ford, financing was such that even the middle class, not just upper class wealthy people, but middle class people could afford forms of locomotion that they hadn't been able to afford before. And what that meant is that you did not have to live where you worked. That was a huge change in our evolution as societies. And so the process of suburbanization began. It took all three of these to give us the topic that we're discussing this evening. This is all brought together in the person of Francis Newlands. So I'm going to say a few biographical words about Newlands. He was born in Natchez in the Mississippi Delta, the son of a preacher and his wife, a preacher that is an immigrant from Scotland. He was somewhat dissolute. He drank too much. He died of alcoholism. The family moved to DC at that point. The wife remarried. There was a little bit more money as a result. And so young Newlands, Francis Newlands, was able to spend a year at Yale University and then attend the forerunner of George Washington Law School, George Washington University Law School. So he got a degree, and he did what many people were doing in this period in the late 1870s, early 1880s, and was written about by Mark Twain in his famous work, The Gilded Age. He was one of those people that went west to make his fortune, and he ended up in San Francisco, and there he got very lucky. He was able to marry into great wealth. He married the heiress to the silver fortune, the Comstock lode in Nevada. His father was Mr. Sharon, and Sharon was the lawyer that handled the affairs of the owners of the mines and was immensely wealthy himself. So he became the son-in-law of this great wealth, married the daughter. Then the father-in-law died, and shortly thereafter, after having several children, his wife died as well. So Newlands ended up as the executor of the estate and heir, and became a billionaire of the day. And he had two ambitions. One ambition was to become a developer. The other ambition was to become a politician, like his father was. His father was one of the senators from Nevada, one of the first. So he teamed up with actually the first senator from Nevada, a man by the name of William Stewart, who was in the Senate for a very long time, from 1865, when Nevada just came into the Union, until 1905, when he died. Together, they bought up land in DC and Maryland along what was to become Connecticut Avenue, from Boundary Street, which is the current day Florida Avenue, which is where DC basically ended, and everything else was farmland to the north of that. They regraded Connecticut Avenue all the way out to the DC Maryland line, and then 2 miles deep into Maryland, and created a lake there and built an amusement park and along Chevy Chase Lake. And then financed a streetcar, uh, electrified streetcar, and then began selling properties along Upper Connecticut Avenue and into Maryland. They were able to buy 1,700 acres. And this streetcar development was launched first in north of Chevy Chase Circle in Maryland in 1892. And the first houses developed along that pretty stretch, a few blocks in length, about half a mile, just north of Chevy Chase Circle, that most of us know. And of course, Francis Newlands built his mansion right on Chevy Chase Circle. It's in the northeast quadrant of Chevy Chase Circle there. It's still there, and it was sold recently for about $25 million. It took until 1907 for the first houses to be built south of Chevy Chase Circle in DC, which is the area that we're concerned with on the DC side of Chevy Chase. So let me talk just for a few seconds about Newland's vision. It was a somewhat weird but quite common fusion of progressive and conservative, outright racist thinking, in fact. So on the one hand, Newlands believed in the positive power of government. This was a progressive element to advance the interest of the citizenry of the United States. And he was most concerned with and associated with mobilizing federal resources to bring water to the desert. So the Great Reclamation Act of 1902 is what he's most famous for, in fact. But he was associated with other progressive causes as well, in particular, rights of the suffrage for women, for instance. So that was the one side of Newlands. The other side of Newlands was as an aggressive white supremacist and an anti-immigration person when it came, not of course to Scotland, where his ancestors came from, but from other parts of the world. We have to remember that this is the great period of European imperialism, where European countries had sway over peoples that didn't look like the Europeans themselves. And here I want to stop for just a second and give praise to someone who's been working on this aspect and all other aspects of Newland's development. And that's, of course, our friend and collaborator, Neil Flanagan, who's just published a very interesting and important piece that I'm borrowing from, in fact, in this brief presentation. So this aggressive white supremacy manifested itself in various ways. And of course, in building a white utopia in Chevy Chase, which is what his vision was all about, Black people were not welcome, and neither were Jewish people, for that matter, although they were harder to keep out for various reasons we get discussed if you wish. Perhaps the most poignant example of his white supremacy was the plank that he put forward in the 1912 Democratic National Convention in Baltimore, where he proposed a white America and the rescinding of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution that was adopted, of course, as I mentioned before, during the Reconstruction period in order to guarantee suffrage to former slaves and their descendants. Another element that gives you some sense of flavor that is more local is what happened in the Belmont section of Chevy Chase that was owned by the Chevy Chase Land Company, of which he was a principal, founded in 1890 with William Stewart. And in Belmont, there was a set of Black entrepreneurs. We have to remember that Washington had a Black bourgeoisie, and they were doing quite well downtown, segregated, of course, But DC was a very important point, a nodal point of development of the Black community during this period in the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th centuries. So there was a Black bourgeoisie. There were people with means. They were willing investors, and they wanted into Newland's project. So they mobilized funds to buy a section of the land that was owned by the land company called Belmont, which is just north of the DC Maryland line along Wisconsin Avenue. Um, and what happened there was that once it was clear that the uh, Black investors had in mind an integrated community uh, for their portion of this part of Chevy Chase. The Chevy Chase Land Company was successful in moving against it. It took them several years to do it, but they were finally denied. This is poignant for at least two reasons. One reason is that, of course, it shows without a shadow of a doubt that race trumped economics, right? This wasn't about the inability of the Black entrepreneurs to come up with the money. They had the money. It was about being Black. And so even if they wanted in, they were denied because they were Black, not because they didn't have the money. The other point about Belmont is if this had been successful, the entire complexion of the DMV, as we know it today, would have been different. We would have had an integrated suburb in a way that was denied in the 20th century. That is beginning to change now, but Black people were, in essence, bottled up within DC in conditions that were very much suboptimal um, during the most of the course of the 20th century. There were other entrepreneurs that took part. Fulton Gordon was one of them, and through Gordon, we had the development of the west side of Connecticut Avenue. The commercial entities that are there to this day owe their existence to Fulton Gordon. Unlike the Chevy Chase Land Company that did not use racial covenants in its deeds, Fulton Gordon routinely inserted them in any deed. And I think one of the slides you're going to see is of the deed to my house, excerpts from it that show you exactly what kind of language was in those deeds. And my house, by the way, is on McKinley Street between Broad Branch Road and Nevada Avenue, so just around the corner from the Broad Branch Black community. So Newlands did succeed in creating a white utopia locally, at least for a time. He had help. Local organizations like the Chevy Chase Land Citizens Association were aggressively racist. In fact, they had a constitution that required people to be white. Article 4 of their constitution, adopted in 1909 and not changed until 1972, required members of the Chevy Chase Citizens Association to be white. They formed a federation with other like-minded citizens associations, and they were the biggest in it. At some point along the way, they had 3,000 members and played an important political role in the period before home rule, partial home rule, that was launched in the 1970s. They had other help as well from the real estate industry and also from the federal government through its redlining legislation in 1934. So there was a lot working with the grain to keep this part of DC white. The legacy is that the Chevy Chase Land Company was successful in doing this. The proof of this is the 1940 census. We've done a forensic research on the enumeration districts of the 1940 federal census for Chevy Chase. And the demographic patterns today reflect what was in place in 1940, in fact. So if you look at the 1940 census, what you see is that there were no blacks living independently, so to speak, in Chevy Chase, DC. There were a few blacks living in Chevy Chase, but they were domestic servants living in white households, or they were custodians that were working in the newly built apartment buildings on Connecticut Avenue. So when the successful community developed, they outgrew the original infrastructure, including E.V. Brown's school at the corner of Connecticut Avenue and McKinley Street, where our Civic Corps is now. So you needed new schools. And it wasn't just happening in our particular neighborhood, it was happening in Tenleytown and Friendship Heights as well. So new schools were on the agenda, and Black communities were targeted as places to remove so that new white schools could be built in their stead. That happened in Reno City, and it happened on Broad Branch Road. And it happened in Broad Branch Road in 1931. So this is the context. This is the background from uh, of the displacement story that Jocelyn has told us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you tonight. And I did just want to say, on a personal note, that the stories that we have just heard from Jocelyn and Carl, although we're all generally familiar now with their outline, they still astound me. I must say, I grew up, as did my sister, at 5807 Chevy Chase Parkway in the 1960s and 1970s. So, in a Jewish American family, with parents who were highly involved from an early moment with the civil rights movement, and yet, and so we were on one level attuned to issues of displacement, dispossession, alienation, the sorts of things Jocelyn and Carl have talked about, and yet utterly oblivious of the history of race-based dispossession right in the neighborhood where we lived, and especially around Lafayette. But tonight I want to talk about another story of land dispossession that's perhaps a little less well known uh, to everybody here, and that's um, the story of it. Suddenly, I can't see my share screen. Give me just a moment. Uh, yeah, and and that's really the story of an area known as the. I'll try to come back a little bit here. uh, Known as the sometimes the Hutton or Hepburn Tract. So we're talking several blocks east of the area that's now Lafayette and Lafayette Pointer Park. So it's another question of Black land ownership. And Kate Atkinson, who can't be with us tonight, has really, in some ways, pioneered a lot of our research, along with some others, into understanding that story. So I want to give us a general sense of what happened with that particular tract of land, and how, again, as Carl said, by 1940, there was really no trace of Black land ownership in the area, but also do a deep dive into one particular family, going back into the era of slavery and then coming up through the generations, to talk about the story of Ruth Ann Dooley Davis and her family, acquiring land immediately after emancipation, and then seeing that land again taken away from them in complicated ways. So the Broad Branch, to take a map, one map here, you can see the Broad Branch area, what be now roughly the area of Lafayette School, and then a little bit to the east, the Hepburn Tract, which has itself a fascinating history, which really goes back to a Revolutionary War hero who acquired a land tract as a reward for his service, that is to say, Colonel Beatty. Um, Acquires part of the land known as the Vale. He then sells that to the local, a local prominent slave owner, Joseph Sprigg Belt, whose great grandfather had acquired the initial covenant or sort of compact to the or patent to the land of Chevy Chase. Uh, and then he sells that land to a free black man, John Hutton, who'd been living here at least since 1800, a very fascinating figure, whose daughter then inherits that land and eventually sells it in 1836 to a free black man, John Hepburn, and his brother Thomas Hepburn. And that land, in other words, from 1813 onwards, we will see for well more than a century, really up until into the 1930s, remains under black land ownership. It's a most extraordinary story, and one that, as I said, I had been entirely oblivious to until recently. So we have, here's a typescript of that fascinating sale all the way back in 1813, acquiring the land from the patent of Colonel Charles Beatty from 1794, and then passing that land into black land ownership. John Hutton has a very interesting and complicated family that we talked about, I think, in our very first session in this series. Going to his daughter, Daphne Hutton, who then becomes Daphne Hutton Brooks, and she's the one who then sells the land. We're talking about individuals that were living close by major slave-owning areas, so we have to think of these islands of free black land ownership, of faith, of schooling, and so forth, surrounded by slave-based plantations, and just nearby George Pointer, by the way, who was, of course, closer to the canal, and then his descendants come up, as you know, into the land that is now that became Dry Meadow Farms, that's now Lafayette. So here we have by 1836, 1837, misspelled Dolphin, Daphne Brooks selling to John Hepburn this land. Now, who were these interesting individuals? Thomas Hepburn, we know, was manumitted by James Aldridge, a really most interesting figure in the history of Prince George's County, who rather unusually manumitted all of his enslaved people in 1833. There was a certain amount of legal to do about that, but ultimately, um, and we're not exactly sure then why the Huttons moved over to this particular area. They see their owners, the Aldridges, had been intermarried with the Belt family, who are so prominent here in Chevy Chase. John, in any case, marries Eliza Hepburn, who had been born free in Anne Arundel County, and then in Prince George's County, and then they move in here, and they set up an area of farming and begin to lay the groundwork immediately after the Civil War for bringing in other newly people who had been free both before the Civil War, but also individuals who had been freed either in D.C. or primarily in Maryland, either in 1862 or 1864. And they're selling land to them. This plan that John Hepburn seems to have had sort of been informally realized, and then after his death, he actually instructs his wife in his will in the early 1870s to finalize these deeds. So we're talking about Rock Creek Ford Road, this little location near Caseta and Rittenhouse in Utah, that a lot of you are familiar with. Especially this little anomalous road, Rock Creek Ford Road, that goes towards Rock Creek. So we can see how close these communities were, and I think it's important to understand that there are close bonds of intermarriage, of shared faith in Rock Creek Baptist Church, and in various religious orders that connect those two communities with the Reno City community that would be a little bit down to the left off of this map, another important post-Civil War African American community, and lots of connections into Black Georgetown as well. So we get a sense of these major buyers, some of whom we already heard about, like Robert Dorsey, who later purchases land in Dry Meadows Farm in the Lafayette Pointer area. And one of the very first buyers is Ruth Ann Davis, whose land you can see at the very top of this plat here, a little more than an acre. And she lives it appears into her 90s and keeps control of that land over most of her life then. And here again, you can see this group surrounded on the one hand by the Morelands to the north, the Shoemakers to the south. These had been major slave owning families who continue to be significant landowners, and the Jones family as well, whose land eventually, some of which will be just adjacent to the new Lafayette School. And you get a sense of some of these major land sales. And it's quite interesting about Ruth Ann Davis that her son-in-law, John Hyson, was one of the founders of what was called White Tabernacle. So there was a series of important post-Civil War fraternal organizations in the African American world. This was one of them, tied in with the so-called the Moses Cemetery that's been in the news a lot. This gives you another sense of this history of really fascinating land ownership from the 1870s through the first few decades of the 20th century, tied together, as I said, to Rock Creek Baptist Church by that fraternal order known as the Ancient United Order of the Sons and Daughters and Brothers and Sisters of Moses. You find them out, everywhere from Delaware to the Eastern Shore to around here, and the local form was in White's Tabernacle. And these ties really lasted for generations and are very fascinating to sort of reconstruct from letters and church records and cemetery records and so forth. And again, as Carl said, here we are back in that neighborhood by 1940. All of those African American families have lost land title. Unlike Broad Branch, where, as Jocelyn mentioned, eminent domain ultimately was used to force out her family, I don't believe that happened in the area that became known as Chevy Chase Grove. Sort of selective enforcement of tax arrears, that is to say, going after people who were delinquent on property taxes. A series of debt notes and so forth were used to force people out. But the end result was, as Jocelyn said, the destruction of the capacity for generational wealth and so forth. But now let's move to a very particular family, Ruth Ann Dooley Davis, who we've touched on. Now we do know a certain amount about her pre-emancipation history. That's partly because, as some of you know, Washington, D.C. had compensated emancipation in 1862. Maryland ended up partially under pressure from the Lincoln administration, emancipating its enslaved people on November 1st, 1864, but without compensation. But Maryland slave owners and the legislature really hoped that to eventually get compensation. So in 1867, 1868, they did construct a fairly significant census of former slave owners in the hope that they, not their former enslaved people, would get compensation. So we rely on those records a great deal that are in Annapolis in the Maryland State Archives. And that shows us that Ruth Ann Davis was enslaved by a woman named Ariana Williams, just a few blocks away from where we are, well, just up really Old Georgetown Road, living with her brother, Richard Williams, up until that important date of November 1st, 1864. But we can actually go back a little bit further because the key figure in understanding where the Davis family came from, the Dooley and Davis family came from, is the remarkable historical figure of Thomas Crampon. Some of you who are familiar with Maryland history may know a little bit about him. He was one of the wealthiest men in the county in the Commonwealth of Maryland. So his sort of seat was the Hermitage. He was involved in the American Revolution. He lived till 91, so when he died in 1830. So he'd been on the Committee of Observation and Correspondence for Frederick County. He was key in the House of Delegates, and then for the ratification of the U.S. Constitution by Maryland, and then became a significant judge on the Montgomery County Orphans Court. So when he died at age 91, depending on how you look at the records, he owned somewhere between 100 to 250 enslaved people, 6,000 acres, all through the different parts of what's now Montgomery County. He's most famous because of a very long-running court case over the status of his common law wife. He never married a white woman. He did love and live with and have many children with a woman named Carolyn Calvert Crampon. And this became a long-running legal case. And the issue partially is that the woman whom he loved and married and had children with, Carolyn Beckett Calvert, was one of the daughters of George Calvert, of course, a descendant of the founder of the state of Maryland. And she was also the daughter of the mulatto woman, Eleanor Beckett, who had been enslaved and then freed by Calvert. So they lived together as man and wife, Thomas Crampon and Carolyn Beckett Calvert, who used the Crampon surname, as man and wife from 1812 until Crampon died in 1830 at age 91. And seven of his children, their children, by the way, did eventually, after securing some, but not all of them, of the funds they had been promised by their father, moved to New York State, in the area around Hamilton, New York, and passed for white. Anyway, his will is utterly fascinating and gives us a lot of interesting hints about the story that we are concerned with. So 10 enslaved people go to his common law black wife, to Carolyn. But then also there's a group of that's a little confusing why they're so important. There's a Richard Williams who seems to be one of the overseers of his farm, of one of the 10 or so farms of Crampon, his mother and his siblings, Alvina, Elizabeth, and Anne. Um, and that is, we begin to gets rather complicated. There's a long running, as I say, court case that goes on in a sense for decades over this, but it does give us a lot of interesting information. There is an attempt by the white heirs of Crampon to utterly slur Carolyn Calvert as essentially a prostitute who had fooled a elderly, infirm, debilitated man. And the white jury, by the way, rejects that and finds that Carolyn agrees with the defense attorney that she had always exhibited good conduct and character, faithful to him as a mistress, and a tender nurse of his old age, and a useful superintendent of his household. But still, once it goes up to the appellate level, the black family is forced through their representative, Mr. Calvert, to settle with the white family. But this does give us a lot of interesting information, which we've tried to sort of chart out here. And you can see that different enslaved people move around within the Williams family, and that explains a lot about the subsequent story. That Alvina Williams, um, who's the daughter of Elizabeth Williams, gets an enslaved woman named Millie. Her sister gets a woman named Nan. There is an associated inventory that makes it clear that Nan had an infant Ruth, who we assume is probably Ruth Davis. They're all clustered together in the same family group. So we're not exactly sure how it is that, I'm sorry, I said Alvina, but sorry, her name was actually Ariana, how Ariana Williams somehow manages to purchase Ruth. There are fascinating letters that come in from the family that the Riversdale House Museum and Riversdale Historical Society have kindly provided us that give us a sense of all of these different connections. The Davis family is part of this story too, because Ruth Ann Dooley marries um, either an enslaved or free man named William Davis. And we know that there's a Henry Davis who escapes from the farm. He almost, as you can see in this ad, almost makes his way to Pennsylvania. He's in Carroll County when he's caught, and he seems to be returned. But William Davis does, in fact, marry Ruth Ann Dooley Davis, and there are other fascinating escapes from the Rock Creek farm, where a lot of the story is swirling around. Some people make it to Pennsylvania, and others don't. Uh, but a very interesting hint from the University of Maryland Special Collections, which the Riversdale House Museum folks have shared, is that the Richard Williams farm does, in fact, arrange for the sale within the Williams family of Ruth, who at this point is 6 years old, and that's almost certainly our Ruth, Ruth Davis. So she's grown up surrounded by this very complex situation of many people near and dear to her being moved around. We see scores of enslaved people from these farms who are then sold off by the Crampon estate to the notorious Armfield, one of the most notorious slave traders that are taken down to Savannah and primarily to New Orleans to be sold off. So she grows up knowing a lot about displacement, but is clearly very committed. Um, uh, uh, After emancipation comes in November 1st, 1864, to here, in fact, we have the record of her emancipation. You can see Ruth and all of her children. Um, uh, uh, and she has her marriage is registered in 1866 in Montgomery County. They've probably been obviously been married a good deal longer, but there was no legal recognition. She may have been tied in with the Henry Dooley estate nearby. Uh, but what gets interesting is that by 18 uh, we do have a free William Davis. This is speculative. We're still working on it. Um, we know that he's apparently born in Washington, D.C., according to the 1900 census. But we can see likely he was free and was marrying a woman and her children who were enslaved because slavery in Maryland followed the state of course, of the mother. So by 1870, you can see they're here nearby on the what's what now would be Chevy Chase, Maryland, living together as man and wife. And then within a couple of years, they purchased this land and are living there for some time. And then they seem to move a good deal around the neighborhood. Uh, um, William was for a time a house painter. He's doing lots of odd jobs. They're making funds through renting out that land. They're quite actively involved in White's Tabernacle, this religious order. They're moving in with family members, but they're facing constant challenges of keeping up with property taxes from the district. White property owners usually had a lot of leeway, but African American property owners often saw white speculators come in and buy up claims to their land, and that's what seems to have happened. So they're moving around the area that's now different parts of Chevy Chase, living with different relatives, being supported to some extent, it would appear, by the rent from that particular land. Um, but then they come under enormous pressure to alienate the land. And the key figure is Fulton Gordon, as you've heard, trying to develop Chevy Chase Grove. He's the one, as Carl said, who instituted racially restrictive covenants. We see that Ruth obviously is having a tough financial period in the early 20th century and is every month is signing promissory notes for $15 each. Those get called in, and she really seems to have very little choice by the time we get to the immediate World War I period. And on 13 August 1921, surrenders all legal claim to that land to resolve her debts to the developer Fulton Gordon. Now, this is where it gets quite fascinating and shows that while there's a generational history of the enslaved and free people on the black side, that many of the white families involved in this story have also multi-generational ties in. The trustees of this sale that ultimately take place in 1926 when the land gets auctioned off, William Minogue and especially Stephen Duncan Bradley, are very interesting figures who have long-term prominent histories, especially on the Bradley side, the great-grandson of Abraham Bradley the fourth, the postmaster general, and the significant slave owner in the neighborhood, who's been out here since the end of the War of 1812. And his grandfather, Joseph Habershad Bradley Sr., purchased at least one young woman, a 13-year-old girl, from this, ultimately from this same group of enslaved people. Um, and then there's this question, why Duncan Bradley is so involved in trying to manage the alienation and resale of the Davis land. He seems, we would say, to be reasserting control over the black descendants of the people his family had enslaved. He claims in a very interesting legal filing in 1930 that he's only doing this because the parties here too, that is to say, the Davises are descendants of old family servants, by which he means slaves. So he's saying we're really looking after them, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence that this was actually their financial benefit. But it is a very interesting reminder of the complex relationship between these generational histories of slavery and post-slavery and real estate that ultimately lead to the loss of we can go through as we see the different ways that the enslaved people in essentially Ruth's cousins are moved around in parts of Tenleytown, and eventually then one of them is sold to Joseph Bradley, and it's his grandson who is in fact ultimately taking control of the Davis land. And we don't know everything because it's hard to figure out the names of all the enslaved people involved, but that's the general picture we can reconstruct. And I'll just move through this to point out that Fulton Gordon himself, as we wrap this up, himself came from out of a slave-owning family in Georgetown. His father was evidently had Confederate sympathies, and at the beginning of the Civil War, left Georgetown, moved across the Potomac into Fairfax, Virginia, which is where Fulton Gordon came from. So his deep commitment to things like racially restrictive covenants, as you can see in one of the many um, deeds in this neighborhood, that the houses can never be used for residence by Negroes or persons of Negro blood or colored persons. So that's the sort of thing that becomes very familiar in these deeds, thanks to him. Um, and I'll just keep moving this. We do know that late in her life, then Ruth Ann Davis, who no longer seems to own the land in question, is living on a tenant farm on the Bradley property, just behind 103 Newlands, in this very interesting picture near the Chevy Chase Club. And I'll keep on moving through all these. We see a lot about what happens to her cousins. Some of them are able to make it in as newly freed people in D.C. Louisa Carter, unfortunately, who's her niece, dies by 1879 of pneumonia. But the family endures without, it's true, they have many challenges. And as Jocelyn said, there were other stories of forced relocation, but it is quite an extraordinary story of perseverance and resilience at the same time as we come down to families that are still present here in the District of Columbia and especially in Prince George's County. So a story of dislocation, but also of great heroism and ingenuity and resilience. So thank you for that. We have a little time for Q&A, and we're going to try to look at some of the questions that have come in. I'll just speak to one question, which was an interesting question from an anonymous attendee about the possible impact that the so-called Atlanta race riot of 1906 might have had on the anti-Belmont sentiment. Carl and Jocelyn may have thoughts on this. I think that it's not just one. There are so many different. Even the phrase "race riot" is one we're somewhat uncomfortable with. But I would say that there were just so many assaults, organized, violent assaults on African Americans, especially African Americans who showed economic capacity, whether or not we're talking about Tulsa or even cases as early as the 1840s here in Washington, D.C., of violent white organized assaults on sites of African American economic and political success that I don't think one single riot or racial battle made such a difference. But of course, that was a major news story. And speaking of news stories, we would need, if you look through the newspapers in the period, I think Carl or Jocelyn can talk about this too, we see a constant sort of litany of, in late 19th, especially early 20th century, claims that there is a wave of black crime in Chevy Chase that is being used to justify the intensification of Jim Crow legislation, of petty and large-scale segregation.
We're almost at our time, but if there are a few more questions, we can extend that a little bit. If you've got any that you can raise your hand if you want, or Mark and Carl and Jocelyn, if you see questions you think you can answer and the ones that have been put in, I don't think we have anybody who's an expert on infrastructure history quite yet, but if you want to help us look into that, we can
We
talk
usually
after the
defer to
event.
David Ramos and his Imaginary Terrain, amazing website on the lost streams of DC on this question of how it exactly is that Broad Branch gets covered up in the Nevada part. And yeah, I know there's a very fascinating infrastructural history, in which is not unrelated to the history of race and also the fact that the DC was rather unusually a military district. It still sort of is, and that has a lot. So the history of military engineering, I know David and people like that have done a lot on, helps us understand a lot about how we move to just little local sewers, as we used to have here, that just went into the local streams, to a more systemic, centralized system that a lot of military engineers are involved with it that becomes a kind of model nationally and internationally. But that's sort of the extent of my knowledge. But there are some people working on that.
So if there are no more questions, I've learned a ton myself tonight, despite having been involved with HCC DC for a decade or more, and despite having lived here for 40 years or so. And it's as if you pick up any piece of sidewalk or take the grass off someone's yard. There's an incredible history that's been buried for so long. That is, and you can see that our speakers tonight have shared some of that, but I suspect you could go plot by plot across this neighborhood and find similar lost history. I guess I want to take the moment then to thank Carl and
If you
Jocelyn.
could just answer the question about the Klan. Carl, do we want to throw that over to you? The question about involvement of the Klan in DC?
Thank you. I mean, I'm out of my depth on that question, I have to admit, but the one thing that I can remind people of that there were 20,000 Klan people marching in D.C. about the time my house was being built in 1919. I think it was a little bit later than that. It was in the early 1920s. So, I mean, the Klan was certainly here and around. I haven't done enough research on that particular aspect of the situation to give a good answer, but I think you do. You have, haven't you?
Well, yeah. I mean, we sometimes there's this specific organization that is the Second Klan, and then there's sort of all the fellow travelers, and there's plenty of that here as well. But the Citizens associations are doing a lot of that very similar work, even if they don't necessarily call themselves the Klan, and are contrasted with the civic associations, which tend to be African American and multiracial in the history of the city. But those are very important questions about the sort of larger, outside of the governmental structures that are clearly, doing all the sorts of things Jocelyn talked about, like eminent domain. Uh, the sort of day in and day out intimidation and pressuring to get people to sell and move out or not show up in schools or not shop in certain places and not pursue certain kinds of employment lines. So that's a major part of the story as well. We've maybe emphasized more the governmental side of it and the real estate side of it, but I think you're right. These different kinds of quasi-political racist, white supremacist organizations have an enormous impact in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Thank you, Mark. And I want to thank not only the panelists and Kate Atkinson, who's out of the country this evening, but also those of you who've joined us and stuck with us for this entire time. So a lot of information, and it is just the tip of the iceberg. Our next and final fourth webinar in this series is June 24th, and we will put out registration stuff for that in several weeks as we get the details of that event organized. For people who are not already members of HCC DC, I invite you to join us. And if you have special expertise or skills or interest in some of these topics we've talked about tonight, we'd love to talk to you more and get some help. We're a volunteer group, and the amazing amount of work that's gone into this and the other events it's been done by people who have had interests like you do and have decided to help us dig into it and document it and make it available. So with that, I want to thank everybody and invite you to join us on the 24th of June. Have a good evening.